Guten Abend, Damen und Herren, Erev Tov, Lekulam. Good evening, everyone here and also at home. My name is Shai Lavi. I'm from the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute. It is with great pleasure that I welcome you to our third and final public lecture discussion in what has proven to be a fascinating 3-day conference on Carl Schmitt's political theology at the Katholische Academy here in Berlin. I wish to extend my gratitude to Stefan Steiner, Kalma ben Yochanan, Itamar ben Ami, Yochi Fischer, Ido Harari, and to all the other good people who were involved in organizing this conference. It is a special privilege and joy for me to chair this session with two eminent scholars of theology, political theology, and other fields, Professor Vivian Liske and Professor John Milbank, both of whom I hold in the highest esteem and to whom I will return in a few minutes. Before I do so, I wish to share with you my understanding of what the organizers of the conference have set to accomplish and have wonderfully and wondrously succeeded to do. More and more, we find ourselves living in a world of either or, a theme that has come up once and again in the past 2 days. A polarized world, a polarized society that is divided into friends and foes, good and evil, legitimate and illegitimate, boycotters and boycotters of boycotters. We may dare to ask ourselves, what's the problem with either or? What's the problem with polarized societies? At the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute, we have a group of students who come in every year, and when we ask them, name one problem that is, in your eyes, the most challenging problem facing society today, they say polarization. And I think it's indicative. It may be blindsided to some of the other problems facing Israeli society and other societies today, but I think there's also something to it. So I don't think, as I see it, that the problem lies in the need to decide. Although Christian Polke and Leor Budnitsky last night have suggested, and I agree, that ambivalence and hesitation may often be a virtue, sometimes we must discern, judge, and make firm decisions of either or. I also don't think that the problem is necessarily polarization per se. After all, polarization is somewhat a relative question and it depends on where you define the center. So, radicalization is not the problem either. I'd like to suggest that the problem lies in the fact that we live in a world in which we are expected to view the decisions that we make as easy ones, as apparent, as self-evident. That we are often confronted with the question, how could anyone who is one of us think that way? How can one of us, liberals or Jews or Catholics or Muslims or Germans or Zionists or Palestinians, think this way? This conference has avoided giving ready-made answers to a few central questions, and I think created a space for all of us to take the time and think. To think about or to ask questions such as, are Jews, German and German Jews, allowed to take seriously the writings of an avowed Nazi? Not to mention the possibility of agreeing with certain of his insights. Are Jews and Christians permitted to reopen a 2,000-year-old Jewish-Christian polemic when their aim is not necessarily to bridge the distance, but to explore it? And finally, if the occasion of a Judeo-Christian hyphenated dialogue also an opportunity to enter into discussion with Islam? Or is this hyphen yet another occasion to sidestep this alte neue other of both Europe and Zionism? In order to think, we needed a room. Not, as Virginia Woolf says, a private room of our own, but rather a room that brought us together to think across theologies, geographies, academic disciplines, and political positions. We came together to challenge ourselves and to challenge each other in what I think has proven to be a very successful event. And now, without much further ado, please allow me to introduce the speakers for tonight in reverse order of their speaking. So Vivian Liska is professor of German literature and director of the Institute of Jewish Studies at the University of Antwerp, Belgium, as well as a distinguished visiting professor in the Faculty of the Humanities at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. She's the editor of many books on modernist literature, German literature, and German Jewish thought, and directs the book series Perspectives on Jewish Texts and Contexts. Her books include When Kafka Said We, Uncommon Communities in German Jewish Literature, Giorgio Agamben's Lehrer Messianismus, Fremde Gemeinschaft, Deutsche Jüdische Literatur der Moderne, and German Jewish Thought and Its Afterlife, A Tenuous Legacy. Our first speaker for tonight is Professor John Milbank, a British theologian, a philosopher, and a political theorist, a professor emeritus of the University of Nottingham. He formerly taught at the University of Lancaster, Cambridge, and Virginia. He is the co-founder of Radical Orthodoxy in Theology and of Blue Labour in British Politics. His several books include Theology and Social Theory, Beyond Secular Order, and with Andrea and Pabst, The Politics of Virtue. Beyond the formal biographies, as I mentioned, these are two wonderful, eminent leaders in their communities, both inside the academia and outside the academia. It is a pleasure to have to hear them, and then to open the discussion between them, as we did last night, and then also to invite here the audience to participate in the conversation. So, John, please.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for those kind words, though I'm not sure whether I'm about to be judged or dissected here, but we've just visited the graves of Hegel and Fichte and Bertolt Brecht, and this is an anatomy theatre, so we just don't seem to be able to get away from dead bodies in the heat this afternoon, but there we go. I changed my mind about what to talk about, so this is now entitled A Tale of Two Monsters, Carl Schmitt, Eurasianism and the Politics of Space. There were always at least two Carl Schmitts. The first Schmitt defended Leviathan, identified as the absolutely sovereign state of a nation in no inherent legal alliance with its exterior. A Hobbesian positivism was reinserted into its original theologically nominalist and voluntarist undergirding, and both were pitted against liberal naivety that is unable to admit to the Hobbesian truth of Lockean self-deception as to the ultimate bounds of liberalism, where lurk always the arbitrary enemy and the arbitrary exception. But the second Schmitt had always been rather more respectful of a longer-term Catholic legacy and of its concern with the internationalism of law and order. This Schmitt, after all, hunted down Leviathan, re-identifying it with the biblical and Kabbalistic sea monster of a false Jewish, Calvinist, and Anglo-Saxon maritime and commercial sway. This was to be contrasted not just with Schmitt's usually normative Hobbesian or Grotian order of periodically suspended and renewed warfare between nation states, but also with a geographically continuous landed terrain of shared legality and even shared imperial rule. The second, increasingly dominant and perhaps more interesting Schmitt also intensified the double challenge to the consoling and narcissistic epistemological framework of both liberal and Marxist thinking? Does real history plausibly unfold within the parameters of general human and individual impulses that we can readily understand, since they are so basely sordid, as paradigmatically with political economy? It seems increasingly implausible to think that. For since we are natural creatures, we may well be compelled by real natural forces that we scarcely comprehend. And since we are also conscious spiritual creatures, we may well be subject to supernatural as well as natural influences, which we comprehend perhaps at once still less, and yet, being conscious and spiritual, rather more. Thus, Schmidt's perhaps most decisive book, Land und Meer, Land and Sea, seeks to trace a kind of elemental history in which humans move from the dominance of the earth to that of water, and then to that of air, and finally to that of apocalyptic fire. The resonances are mystically esoteric and yet also naturalistic and ecological in a way that suggests affinities with Russian Eurasianism, for which cultures arise, flourish, and decline in response to cosmic influences that may be more or less material or more or less spiritual. The occult always hovers in this mentality. At the same time, what is equally determinative for the later Schmitt are collective and elective human affinities for one element or the other as the real driving force of history. Compared with the focus of the first Schmitt upon the ultimately amoral logic of decision and association, these parameters are less humanistic and more speculative, perhaps like those of the later Heidegger, one could suggest, and yet they are also much more searching and wide-ranging. The framework of the merely political is, in effect, abandoned. It's abandoned in favor of the at once political, economic, and ecological notion of the nomos of the earth. In the book of that name, citing Gian-Battista Vico, Carl Schmitt argues that the first law was the division of the fields that was coeval with the delineation of burial grounds, just been there, and the securing of the continuance of the landed names of the dead through rights of legal connubium guaranteed by vengeful providence. In this way, we arrive at a point of extreme conjuncture between the sheerly physical, the culturally continuous, the economic, the legal, political, and the theological. Something like a more ethnographically informed notion of a jus gentium, or law of the nations, is invoked by Schmitt, with apparent priority, after all, to the state law of political exception. Now, we've already started to discuss this issue, and it's genuinely difficult to sort out. It's controversial, and I may not have got it right, but it does seem to me that you can argue that in the wake of Hitler, Schmitt actually does move away from decisionism. He moves to a perspective for which normativity derives much more through the mediation of the people as an ethnos linked to the soil. In other words, let's be frank, it becomes much more Nazi. Even if appropriated land is arbitrary, even if land is legalized by a kind of decisionistic cut, as Carlo Galli puts it in his enormous book on Schmitt, I don't think that that's an adequate account. It's not just a decisionistic cut. It's something that for Schmitt emerges almost mystically up from the earth itself. It is really profoundly ecological in character, albeit in a very dark way. It is literally blood and soil, so that the nomos of the earth is legitimated by a sacral authority that links a particular people to a terrain. And this is why, for Schmitt, the ultimate legitimation is not sort of occupation or Lockean labor. On the contrary, as for Vico, it is a mystical naming of the land that gives you the first law. So this priority, or this new priority of the notion of the nomos over the notion of the exception, also seems to call into question the modern post-Westphalian system of partially regulated international anarchy. Now it is shared, if always already divided, terrain that assumes priority over ethnic borders. Thus, for Schmitt, in the Nomos of the Earth, it's Europe that is the prime land, the prime terrain. And he's powerfully aware that for most of civilized history, peoples have acknowledged an authority which extended over most of their known world. Ancient China, for example, or medieval Europe. This, for him, is the first nomos of the earth in human history. As to what went on within people's known worlds, this was nothing like a balance of power between states. The European jus gentium was originally a law of peoples linked to Catholicism and canon law with its Roman Stoic background, besides the catechon role exerted by the Holy Roman Emperor. And Schmitt seems never to go back on the importance of the catechon, and he insists very strongly that the catechon authority is not that of a Caesar. It is an apocalyptic delayer acting at a kind of meta level to keep sort of disorder somehow at a minimum and operating at an international level. So what happens after the Holy Roman Emperor goes, what happens to the catechon seems to me a real question. And perhaps, as with Kantorowicz, an element of south-looking politics in Schmitt in relation to Germany, even though I'm going to go on to argue that actually Ostpolitik for him is very, very decisive. So the jus gentium in the Middle Ages is not just something agreed between international nations, and thus it was a full part of the natural law. Indeed, the jus gentium was the mediator of the natural law up to the time of Francisco Suarez, who now saw its actual prohibitions as positive laws set up by contracting sovereign state partners. So there's an inversion that after the time of the Spanish scholastics, national law starts to assume priority and international relations are only secondary. That was never the case in the High and the Middle Ages. And I think Schmitt's attitude to that distinction is more complicated and ambiguous than maybe at first appears. So in the European Middle Ages, there, of course, existed no states, and therefore there were no wars between states. There were many wars between nobles, which were bound up with what was seen as the restitution of justice or the remedying of crimes, while wars between kings usually had a dynastic aspect and generally concerned the extension of terrain rather than the defense of boundaries. And so in this context, Schmitt clearly celebrates the boundary, the land boundary of the whole of Europe. And he contrasts that with the emptiness of everywhere else. So he doesn't, in fact, celebrate the modern national state and its land as fully natural and sacral. He deliberately says that that is not the case. So his attitude towards the modern nation state becomes much more difficult. And in fact, he links the reality of the modern nation state to possession and domination, which he does not view positively. He thinks that the modern nation state emerges coevally with the looking outwards beyond Europe. In other words, the modern nation state is somehow linked to the non-nomos of everywhere else. And therefore there's something very inherently at least ambiguous about that. It's already looking out to the anarchy of the sea, and by having this attitude of merely no longer grounding things in a sort of sacral quasi-Nazi unity of blood and soil and the people, but instead in the idea of a sort of arbitrary rulers dominating thing, in other words, the more decisionistic model, is now seen as actually rather dubious. And it's very, very significant that he also thinks that the early modern period is a point of transition. So he deliberately says that somehow the initial Spanish conquests under the authority of the Pope are kind of legitimate because they're an extension of mission and an extension of legitimate commerce, which he somehow wants to see as pre-technological, pre-mere economy. It's a Catholic conquest that is somehow bringing Latin America within this European sacral space. And Schmitt very deliberately contrasts this with what he sees as a later Protestant phase of imperialism and colonialism that's much more dominated. It's no longer anything to do with the Pope. It's no longer a sacral, cultural, holy mission. It's just brutally about occupation and making money. And it's for that reason that you become open to the high seas, that something completely anarchic is starting to take over. And eventually, according to Schmitt, it's the invasion of this sea space into Europe that will corrupt and destroy Europe. And of course, the English and the Americans are to blame here. I mean, it's, that is incredibly clear. So the question seems to arise as to whether Schmitt really regarded the modern international situation of international anarchy, where wars are kind of amoral and you can have the just enemy on either side. And I agree that most of the time that seems to be the case. So, I'm not claiming to totally resolve this tension in his thought. I don't completely understand it, and I probably need help with that. But nonetheless, it does seem to me that he also at times appeals back to the norm of the Jus Gentium, or has a nostalgia for that norm of the Jus Gentium that is overseen by the Pope and Emperor. It might seem in Land and Sea as if he thinks of the Calvinist maritime and commercial imperial order as perverting the normativity of land-based internecine conflict between states, the anti-reign of the English pirates who are the enemy of all. And indeed, he blames the intrusion of just this piratical order upon continental Europe for the outbreak of both the 30 Years' War and for the outbreak of World War I and II, implausibly exculpating East German Protestantism with its own expansionary drives in either case, letting the Prussians off the hook, in other words. Yet he also suggests that today, in the modern world, the balance of powers and a kind of quasi-imperial dominance needs to be given something approaching international legal recognition for the sake of peace. He says this in Land and Sea. So he doesn't seem to completely say that the kind of Grotian situation is enough. Moreover, he invokes a new overarching international power over air and fire that a greater Germany might now deploy to trump the Anglo-Saxon command of the fluid elements. An imperial note is surely sounded here. In more world historical terms, he is essentially contrasting an imperial of the earth with an imperium of the sea. And here his realism of the exception seems to yield priority, as I'm arguing, to a basically Nazi atavism of the soil. He allows that from the outset there have always been fish humans, as he describes them, who live in the Pacific Ocean, but literally he grants them no fully human status because they have inverted the supposedly natural human belonging with native soil, a perversion that will be later repeated on a global scale by the Jews and by the Anglo-Saxons. It's impossible here to overlook Schmidt's Ostpolitik favoring of the Russian behemoth, the imperial land beast, over the English Leviathan, which after all, like Melville's white whale, proves to know no sovereign bonds and is rather the infinitely open anti-terrain of marauding sea rovers. So this is the crucial thing. Hitler's mistake for Schmidt was to have not maintained the pact with Stalin. Hitler's mistake was to have gone to war with Russia. And I think that tells you everything. For all the excoriation of the rise of the ideological partisan and modern absolute enmity, it would seem nonetheless the freebooting Anglo-Saxon mercenary, like the Jewish trader, is also an absolute enemy because he is the enemy of humanity as such, as Schmidt understands it. In this way, then, Schmidt would appear to favor Eurasianism as an ideology of land, and to be not so far removed from various later Russian theorists like Gumilev, Panarin, and Dugin, who associate the human with an immediate ecological context that co-shapes the behavior of particular ethnoi in ways that cannot be readily mediated in a universal manner. These thinkers, Gubarev notably, even under Soviet publishing auspices, notice, denounce chimeric ethnicities like the Jews or the Kazakhs, because the Kazakhs, before they were Muslims, had once upon a time converted to Judaism. According to these people, that perverted Kazakhstan forever. And various Gnostic, world-refusing cultures. It's a particular pity Agatha's not here to debate that one. And one could also note in general that the Eurasians in Russia reduce Orthodox Christianity to a merely ethnic folkloric expression, apparently, with the support of Patriarch Kirill these days. And it's also very significant that they much prefer Islam to Judaism. And in fact, they much prefer Islam to Catholicism because they think that Islam has a natural fusion of the religion and the political. So they have more and more moved to seeing Islam as compatible with Russianness and close to orthodoxy, whereas neither Judaism nor Catholicism are compatible with being Russian. I think we've got to be aware of this. We've got to be aware of what now hovers behind the activities of Vladimir Putin. So there's little sign of any Catholic universalizing personalism in the case of any of this. And as with the Russians, Schmidt implicitly gives rise to questions that are unsolvable in their own term, in his terms, as to just how the various ethnicities are to be linked within an overall greater ethnic imperial order, and to what extent there will be pluralism or a kind of liberal choice at a group level, as Alexander Dugin wants, or else one domineering ethnos, one master race, be this either Germanic or Russian or both. And it's very evident that again and again, so-called Russian arguments for imperialism disguise a Russian ethnic nationalism. More generally, one can question the notion of the innocence of the earth and the guilt of water, which, after all, for Christians is supposed to be sacramentally cleansing. The seamless continuity of territorial proximity is no salve against violence. despite Schmidt's attempted praise of supposedly limited national wars, and Gumilev and Dugin's downplaying of the interethnic struggles and domineering behavior of the ethnic Russians in the Russian past. In many ways, the rather accidental rise of the Russian Empire, its progress eastwards, emerged through a kind of political consolidation of what were originally economic trading purposes in a way that's really uncannily like the way the British advanced into India across the ocean. So I would submit that a land-sea contrast is being over-invoked at this kind of point. Now, it may be fair to note that a thinker like Karl Polanyi on the left also linked the lack of maritime limits and internal disappropriation of the peasantry to the rise of capitalism. But at the same time, as I think Polanyi realized, the release of open space, aesthetically, politically, cosmically, since the time of the Renaissance, can also be the freeing of a space for a freer and more consciously shared relational encounter between persons and between peoples, rather than one of abstract control at a distance. Indeed, one can note that in really ancient times, it was the impenetrable forest that was a barrier that divided people, whereas water was much more navigable, and in fact, islands like Malta or the Orkney Islands to the north of Britain, these were the centers of Stone Age civilization. The association of water with non-linkage, antagonism, and anarchy is surely an inaccurate one. And maritime empires have, after all, sustained at times mutually beneficial encounters between more extremely different cultures, as in the case of the British and French empires, than is the case with contiguous landed cultures. While conversely, landed empires have by no means always been innocent of the direct pressures of hegemony opened up by contiguity and continuity. Above all, it is the case, as with the unwritten human law of hospitality, that generosity tends paradoxically to be exercised mainly among friends, and yet also to be the only recourse when dealing with complete cultural strangers. The commercial waters of indifference flow rather somewhere between these two poles in the region of eventually murderous politeness. But that region can fall as much across the street where you live as it lie across the oceans. In the end, one is struck by the failure, in the case of both Schmidt and the Russian theorists, to consider the possibility that we might all be united in charity under a transcendent carapace that exceeds the contrast of either an empty and post-human universalism or a confinement to the soil that, after all, sinks us into a kind of pre-humanity. So in the final bit of this paper, I want to say something directly about the relevance of this to our current situation already invoked in the introduction. For all the ultimately sinister character of Schmidt's thought and the Eurasianist thought, it seems impossible to ignore their new, in effect, postmodern and post-secular attempt to take into more account the ineffable influences of nature and spirit upon human cohesion and transformation. We can't go back to Marx now. It just looks too old-fashioned. We have today arrived at a point of global crisis which is perceived as a matter of politics, science, ecology, and economics. But in reality, it's a spiritual crisis. This does not mean that we should retire from the political to the cultural sphere or retreat further into ourselves. Instead, it means we need a new spiritual politics. One aspect of this crisis clearly concerns our relationship with the natural world, but we tend to think of this aspect as self-enclosed, rather than being inherently linked to the problem of political division that we're encountering at the same time, in which you invoke the problem of polarity between liberal democracy and authoritarianism, populist or otherwise. To the contrary, I think, our modern idea of politics is inherently linked ever since Hobbes and others, to a certain stance towards the natural world. We consider the natural world to be over against us, as a threatening, all-encompassing power that can also be tamed and exploited as an inexhaustible resource. At the same time, we acknowledge that we ourselves as embodied animals belong to that world. Yet insofar as we know this, we also suppose that this belonging is largely negative, a source of our indigency, fearfulness, and ignorance. Additionally, our shared animal nature, again on the Hobbesian model, is thought to entail a doubling of all these supposed natural tendencies by a factor of mutual human rivalry. The only way out then of this natural trap appears to be through artifice. An alien world is to be known through the joint application, known and mastered through the joint application of reason and experiment. What goes for science goes also for politics, now thought of as an essentially social technology. Bacon and Hobbes and Descartes all belong together. To ensure both certainty and security, all political power is supposed to be derived from one source of monopolized violence. How this sovereignty is to be constitutionally achieved and sustained can be conceived in variously more authoritarian, oligarchic, or democratic ways. But from one perspective, those differences are irrelevant. What matters is that we think of politics, political economy, and public technology as a pragmatic control of supposedly meaningless nature, including the meaninglessness of our own bodies and instincts that are supposed to have just arrived by evolutionary accident. It's unsurprising that this outlook should have eventually generated what looks rather like a final apocalyptic crisis. And the weather has been kind to my thesis here, if unkind in every other imaginable way. Nature is ravaged, and our own bodies are increasingly diseased, distorted, bloated, and abused. In the face of ecological disaster, Liberal Democrats variously propose an evolution to a global Leviathan, a sovereign world government that will rule in the name of a qualified and more cautious scientific domination, a yet more monstrous sea creature who will hopefully keep at bay the Chinese behemoth, who is curiously similar, perhaps because the whale is after all a breathing mammal and not a genuine fish, as Schmitt, the ever-aware, of course, notes with full hinted symbolic resonance. They are increasingly opposed by authoritarian populists who remain attached to the nation state or to localized sovereignty and tend to evade the seriousness of the collapse of the physical world. Populists also seem to favor a cultural or ethnicist nationalism or national imperialism based upon the ultimacy of the friend-foe distinction. Their atavism is rightly deplored by liberals, and yet the populist fears of an ever more extreme social engineering in the face of natural crisis, exercised by a single or still worse by rival global powers, appears to me to be not at all displaced. In either case, however, a modern duality of spirit and matter, of artifice and nature, has not really been left behind, it's only mutated. Either our neglect of nature that is seen as a self-sustaining whole to which we must instrumentally adapt is deplored, or else the militant triumph of the human spirit in always particular idioms is newly celebrated, sometimes in religious guise. The alternative to this is for Christianity and Judaism, in alliance with other faith traditions, to insist that it's this very duality that is the problem, and the politics based upon it. Ironically, we abuse nature just because we do not see the primacy of spirit over nature in the deepest sense. The underlying impulses within nature herself are spiritual. Creative powers mysteriously inclined to adopt certain consistent forms and habits, as the basically Augustinian tradition of French spiritualism from Maine de Biron onwards has always taught. It's now fortunately reviving. We're superficially related to these powers by our external ability to manipulate them, but we are more profoundly and immediately related to them by our own internal powers of feeling and imagination. and an insight shared by the Bahrainians within seemingly quite different post-Puritan tradition of American transcendentalism, inaugurated by Ralph Waldo Emerson, an absolutely wonderful thinker whom you only despise, as I did for a long time, you only despise until you've read him. For these traditions, the question posed to us by nature, of which we are part, is not mainly how she may be tamed and exploited, but how she may be fulfilled as beautiful and therefore as also true and good by human spirits in consociation with each other and with their surroundings. It's the goal of an integral ecology talked about by the Pope. Unless we repent, turn round and pursue this goal, we're lost. For there is nothing accidental about the ecological mess we find ourselves within. It derives directly from our mode of economics as appropriation of natural and human resources, exploitation of land as rent, and human bodies for profit. It derives equally from our mode of politics as methodological control without final purpose. It derives perhaps most of all from our false assumption that a science pursuing only superficial description and regular manipulation, windscreen knowledge, as Owen Barfield puts it, provides the deepest truth about nature. It's on account of this assumption we're now prepared to try to dissolve the essences even of gender and of humanity itself under the contradictory imperative of a still human but anarchic individual and nominalist will to alterations in the interests of power. The standard liberal democratic proposals merely to consolidate and tweak these theoretical come practical idioms of our culture can only solve the ecological problem at the cost of tyranny. Moreover, if a more tempered approach to our physical environment is adopted purely as an expedient to be abandoned when economic profit or political control collapses, then further down the line of history, it will only generate further environmental crisis. This is the element of truth in the instinctive populist suspicion, supported by Giorgio Agamben, that successively terrorism, financial crisis, COVID pandemic and shortages of food and energy now are exploited as Schmittian emergencies in order for Leviathan or Behemoth to exercise yet further domination over a subordinated population through the ever-intensified employment of surveillance, robotics, and digitalization. One does not have to give any credence to conspiracy theories to allow for the degree of truth here. For from the outset, the modern notion of single sovereign power over against a mass of isolated individuals who only accidentally coagulate was predicated on the notion of natural emergency, which reimpinges in the face of the breakdown of cultural unity, as in the wake of the European Reformation. The threat of such has to be sustained if sovereignty itself is to be sustained. And where sovereignty is threatened, then emergency may be artificially produced or real emergency exaggerated. Don't underestimate the idea that apocalyptic horror will simply be exploited by capitalism and the sovereign state. You know, as the Frederick Jameson, famous Marxist literary critic, puts it, you know, the world will probably end before capitalism comes to an end, you know. There we go. But the hysterical half-grasp of this reality by populism is not the answer, any more than is its retreat to the sovereign nation state that can't handle a weakening of nature which knows no boundaries, nor the unrestricted flows of finance, capital, and people which today thwart any attempt to realize social justice in one country. Nor can individual states respond adequately to the mutation of capitalism into a neo-feudalism that extracts profits from rents on drained lands, from vectoral control of information, and from financial speculation rather than from production, which is now in that continuous crisis of profitability, indeed, to be fair to him, anticipated by Marx. All this engenders an increasingly pacified, homeless, and workless people, confined to the soft tyranny of sad leisure and tedious pleasure. We've already seen now why the outdated materialism, whether old or new, I'm told there's something called new materialism, but it can't be right. We can now see why the materialism of liberals and most of the left can't provide the answer either. Our entire natural political crisis is rooted in the double denial of spirit to nature and of the ultimate spiritual rule of nature by human and angelic spirits, as opposed to her cruel oppression by the human understanding uninformed by sacred wisdom. So this means politically we need a return to the natural order, as Catholic social teaching has consistently taught. All single sovereignty of the state must be demolished. Instead, from the village to the planet, we need to return to the complex networks of gift-exchanging communities and corporations, which naturally and traditionally pursue intrinsic good purpose and virtue, out of which, perhaps, a true and relatively more peaceful order can be distilled. This requires dispersed democratic assent and various coordination by single individuals, but it also requires the rule of spirit rather than of the technicians of matter, as René Guénon once rightly declared. And to that extent, I do think that Alexander Dugin is right, however much he gets horrendously wrong. The wisest who most discern spiritual ends and can direct both nature and culture teleologically towards those ends have to be given a certain sort of crucial and privileged role. Their counsel must be proffered to the people, and then the politically wise and virtuous, as genuine warrior ruler representatives, must instigate the working through of such accepted counsel in a practice within which all can participate. This goes beyond our normal left-right divisions. Without such a clerisy, as Samuel Taylor Coleridge termed it, and an integral directing of the secular towards the religious, what we get instead is the rule of the charlatans, the egoists, and the profiteers, to the infinite distress of nature herself and the attempted exhaustion of her powers. That's impossible, but they can only be newly realized to human benefit if we recognize they are both instigated and fulfilled in spiritual creativity, conviviality, and contemplation. For that, you need both saints and heroes. To this extent, again, Guénon and Dugin would seem to be right. The abolition of traditional estates since the French Revolution in favor of a state standing over against isolated individuals without mediating associations has proved a sham, since in reality, as Auguste Comte foresaw and advocated, we have a pseudo-Brahmin class of scientific technocrats directing the work of a pseudo-Kshatriya class of politicians without honor, who utterly subordinate all the Vaishyas, that's everyone else, all the rest of us, who are now altogether removed from the inspiration of the soil or of the waters and from the fulfillment of creative labor. So only a spiritual revolution will save us now. But that means also real social, economic, and political transformation, striving towards something like a more democratic version of a society of estates, with greater respect and reward for every function, contemplative, ruling, or working, besides a greater fluidity between them and a greater echoing of all three at every level. Perhaps that was the way early Hinduism looked before it got corrupted. We need additionally a sense of mediating balance, of mutualist protection in the global interflow of goods and people, thereby allowing that we've always been fishes as well as squirrels, steppe nomads as well as forest dwellers, in ways that the theorists of Eurasian integration tend hypocritically to overlook. This is the exact opposite to the illusions we're now pursuing in Europe. It's opposite to the illusion being pursued by the United Kingdom of a retreat to the piratical sea of totally unregulated liberal commerce. It's only going to engulf us. We're already sinking, we're already drowning. But it's also the exact opposite to the illusions currently pursued by Germany. of an expansion of a post-democratic legal commercial landmass for sheerly pragmatic reasons, under the Habermasian conviction that we now live in post-heroic times when military struggle has become unthinkable. Well, tell that to the Ukrainians is all that I can say. And the German shilly-shallying over that is to its shame. Such smugly pretended pacifism, as we now know, proves to be but the continuation of an older Germanic military dominance by other economic means, let's call it Kantianism, and a potential capitulation to tyranny and to actual military blackmail. We also need to guard against a tendency to lose sight of the qualitative difference between Auschwitz and the Japanese atrocities during World War II and various other human horrors. This tends to occur if we start to view, as a lot of third world theorists now advocate, and is starting to creep into Western universities, if we accept the view that somehow the Nazi phenomenon is only kind of the ultimate extension or the application to Europe of colonial domination, despite the fact that there are admitted continuities. If we embrace that thesis, if we lose the sense of the proportional difference of what the Nazis did, or indeed what Stalin did, then actually we're succumbing to this idea, this Schmittian idea, that the sea and the sea empire is somehow less authentic than the land empire and responsible for contaminating the land. Whereas I'm trying to suggest that they may be both problematic, and land empire can be seen at least as horrific. More generally, we need to beware of thinking of empire as a kind of interruptive anomaly, as so much post-colonial thought does, and of the nation state or the expanded nation state as normative. Once again, if we do that, we're succumbing to another aspect of Schmitt's attitudes, the earlier, more decisionistic ones in relation to the nation state. So, final remark, in the future, we need instead all of us to try to dwell within all four elements, sustaining both spatial distance and spatial communion in relationality, united not by the chattering airways or the hovering fire of eventual destruction, but by the biblical upper sea of the heavenly and its aerial illuminations. Thank you.
I'm sure that we will have lots to discuss about why we're dealing with Schmitt, as Stefan asked yesterday, and that will be a common ground as a question. I am only a literature person, so I'm afraid I will not be able to tell you everything we need to do. I will therefore only begin with a piece of literature. It is from Kafka's The Burrow, written in the same year as Schmitt's Political Theology. It is the story of an animal building a burrow, and he says at some point the following: I'm not far from the decision to go into the distance, to take up again the old desolate life, which had no security at all. Certainly such a decision would be complete foolishness, caused only by having lived for too long in meaningless freedom. I have only one step to take and I'm safe, and so I tear myself away from all doubts and run straight towards the door in broad daylight to lift it for sure, but I can't. Should I therefore rebuild this entrance? I postpone the decision, and it will probably all stay as it is. This certainty will bring me either reassurance or despair, but as it will be this or that, it will be undoubted and justified. This decision makes me feel good. The only decision that brings solace to the creature in his burrow is the one to postpone the decision. But even this decision and the good feeling it provides don't last. 2 sentences later, the creature continues to ruminate about the conditions that would make the decision not to decide possible, only to find that these conditions are both contradictory and inscrutable. The decisive moment, Kafka writes in an aphorism, is ongoing, immerwährend. So I am certainly with the animal when I say that I will not be able to tell you what we need to do. In my abstract, I announced that I would discuss important German Jewish critical modernists who invoked the Jewish tradition in their conceptualization of topics that were also central to Carl Schmitt's thought. This is still valid. My announcement that my lecture, quote from my abstract, will explore how these German Jewish thinkers configured sovereignty, decisionism, the state of exception, and the relationship between friend and enemy in light of the Jewish tradition, end of quote, however, suggests a hubris that I herewith want to retract. It is all the fault of the organizers who should have told me that this sounds like a nice book project, and that I have 25 minutes. My protagonists will remain the same, but I will limit myself to juxtaposing their approach to one aspect, Schmitt's decisionism. What Schmitt calls decisionism both and often simultaneously fascinated and repelled many of the major German Jewish thinkers and intellectuals of the early 20th century. Rather than drawing on the actual Jewish reception of Schmitt in the strict sense of the term, I will explore thought figures in the writings of some of these Jewish contemporaries of Schmitt, in which central features of his decisionism play a major role. As Kurt Sontheimer in his Antidemokratisches Denken in der Weimarer Republik has pointed out, quote, a tough insistence on decision, ein hartes Pochen auf Entscheidung, an either-or thinking calling for a decisive commitment and rejecting mediating positions, end of quote, was a crucial feature of anti-democratic discourses of the time. More generally, it was a response to the historicist relativism of the 19th century and to liberal modernity as such. I will focus here on German Jewish thinkers and authors associated by Stefan Moses with critical Jewish modernity, Franz Kafka, Gershom Scholem, Walter Benjamin, Hannah Arendt, who address the notion of Entscheidung in a Schmittian sense, and who, in this context, evoked, alluded to, or reconfigured aspects of the Jewish tradition, the Bible, the Talmud, or medieval Jewish thought. A striking feature of these thinkers' thought is a sustained tension between a sudden and abrupt, decisive moment on the one hand, and an extreme expansion of time in waiting, deferral, and postponement on the other. The Jewish dimension of this tension becomes most visible when it is juxtaposed to the Christian underpinnings of what Kierkegaard called the decisive moment. And this is his quote, and now the Augenblicket, the moment, such as this, is unique. To be sure, it is short and temporal, as the moment is. It is passing as the moment is past, as the moment is in the next moment, and yet it is decisive. And yet it is filled with the eternal. A moment such as this must have a special name. Let us call it the fullness of time. This notion can be traced back and indeed developed in the thought of thinkers close to or inspired by Christian theological elements, more particularly by Paul's pleroma of the chronos, literally the fullness of time. And in modern times, this reaches indeed from Kierkegaard's Augenblick or Christ moment to Giorgio Agamben's point of indistinction invoking a Pauline end of times. Schmidt's decisionism has, all differences considered, links to both. Schmidt's concept of the decision has been called, I quote, a politicization and theoretical transformation of Kierkegaard's concept of the moment, a designation that goes as far as saying Kierkegaard's moment becomes Schmidt's decision. The temporality of Agamben's Pauline messianism is in turn, again, all differences considered, and they are considerable, indebted to Schmidt's decisionism. In what follows, I propose to consider the approach to the decision in the writings of Scholem, Benjamin Arendt, and somewhat Kafka, none of them liberals, the natural enemies of Schmidt, against this background. Schmidt famously speaks of a pure, non-argued, and non-discussing, not self-justifying, thus absolute decision created out of nothing. And just to hear it in the German, eine reine, nicht resonierende und nicht diskutierende, sich nicht rechtfertigende, also aus dem Nichts geschaffene, absolute Entscheidung. He elaborates on the origin of the purity and absoluteness of this gesture. Quote, the subject of the decision has an independent meaning apart from the question of content, in contrast with the ongoing conversation or the endless discussion that paralyzes the sovereign's decision belongs to what Schmidt calls a grand rhetoric, a performative expression that manifests authority, asserts power and determination. The gesture it describes is one of unwavering resoluteness and immediacy that is executed without hesitation and is exempt from self-legitimation by a sovereign who, on the threshold of legality, suspends the legal order. Schmidt's hailing of a sovereign ruler either structurally modeled on or derived from divine power, or, as Shire suggested today, projected backward to create out of nothing, to suspend the laws of nature and the miracle, and to transcend all accountability, lies at the core of Schmidt's decisionism. For many Jewish critics of this view, this involves an implicit divinization of the human that correlates with idolatry, a notion of the divine divested of any covenantal responsibility, and the purification of the human realm from the messy plurality in which decisions, if they indeed are to be pure and absolute, come about only at the price of dictatorial power, a price Schmidt was more than willing to pay. The German Jewish thinkers discussed here similarly address modernity as a crisis, and decisionism is more often than not within the horizon of their thought, aware of, or at least sensing, the authoritarian implications of this solution, however. They also ward it off in the form of a radical deferral, be it as delay, hesitation, or procrastination. These thinkers' textual enactments of deferral and delay can be regarded in some ways as structural inversions of Schmidt's sovereign decisionism, like his idea of a contentless decision. Their various enactments of deferral are often largely independent of the contents and contexts. Instead, they turn it into a mode of apprehending a situation of crisis as such, and indeed to ward off the decision in the way described by Schmidt. My first protagonist, Scholem. Gershom Scholem's deferment. His ambivalence toward decisionism can be found in his idea of the deferral of tradition, der unendliche Aufschub der Tradition, in the oral Torah, the Talmud, that endlessly interprets the written commandments, as well as in his famous characterization of Jewish existence as a life lived in deferment, in which nothing can be done definitively, nothing can be irrevocably accomplished. Now, whether Scholem's description is meant as a critique of the Jews' lack of active participation in history, or a praising affirmation of their awareness of the unredeemed state of humanity is subject to controversy. In his major essay of 1959 on the Messianic idea in Judaism, Scholem attributes this ambivalence to the Messianic idea in Judaism that longs for redemption as much as it keeps it at bay. I quote, "The presumably unending need to prevent the coming of the end is," Scholem writes, "both the greatness and constitutional weakness of Jewish messianism. This ambivalence is an expression of the tension between Scholem's attraction to a radical, even apocalyptic event and a deflection of such a decisive moment in deferral. Scholem's attraction to a momentous event is a manifestation of his rejection of both the neo-Kantian idea of history as an infinite task, as well as the historicist idea of gradual progression toward the telos. Scholem indeed conceives of redemption as a sudden and radical rupture that suddenly breaks in from the outside. But this suddenness contrasts with his attribution of greatness to the messianic idea of postponement. Scholem's praise of delaying the decisive moment has an antecedent in his early writings. In Yonah and the Concept of Justice from 1917, Scholem writes, "Acting in deferral saves from death." In this essay, Scholem develops an idea of justice in Judaism that is intricately bound up with his view of a Jewish idea of time. The essay focuses on the biblical and Talmudic topic of delaying the execution of a verdict. So, just as God has judged, but he executed it not, he quotes this, his essay focuses on the biblical and Talmudic topic of delaying the execution of a verdict. This attitude indeed corresponds to what in the Mishnah Sanhedrin is said about judging a case of capital punishment. If the accused is judged to be innocent, he must be liberated immediately. If, however, he is judged to be guilty, the judges should, quote, sit through the night, and the execution should only take place on the following day. Similarly, the execution should take place outside of the city. Maimonides, who is mentioned by Scholem in this context, comments on this law that the change of location between verdict and execution creates a delay that should give the judges time to reconsider the punishment or allow for a possible witness to speak on behalf of the convicted. Delaying the execution thus intimates an act of mercy. In a diary entry from 1918, Scholem calls deferral, quote, one of the central ethical ideas of the Messianic tradition in Judaism. Not only is it linked to compassion, it also has a political impetus, as it manifests an implicit suspicion of the sovereign judges in the face of potential injustice. In his essay on Yonah, Scholem explicitly opposes deferral to what he considers to be the core of a Christian approach to justice. Justice, Scholem writes, is the indifference to the last judgment. That means within it unfolds that sphere in which the enactment of the last judgment is infinitely deferred. My second protagonist, Walter Benjamin, Scholem's reflection on the book of Yonah were developed in close dialogue with Benjamin at the time when they lived and thought together in Switzerland. Benjamin rarely makes his affirmation of deferral as explicit as Scholem does, and more frequently and in different contexts calls for a readiness to decide that echoes Schmidt's decisionism. The tension between these two modes of confronting situations of crisis is, in Benjamin, dialectically related in ways that characterize his entire approach to the interaction between tradition and modernity, theology and politics, Judaism and secularism. Unlike Scholem, Benjamin, as we all know, had direct contact with Schmidt. Explicitly, the relationship between the two consisted of several mutual cross-references and an almost subservient letter that Benjamin wrote to Schmidt. Implicitly, however, the subliminal dialogue between them constitutes what Agamben called, quote, a sort of obscure chess match. It has, meanwhile, also become, and of course this is a reference to Benjamin's chess machine, not least because, meanwhile, it has also become a standard debate and a particularly contentious phenomenon, not least because it prefigures in many ways the current leftist Schmittians and its divisive corollaries. And this is something that does interest me particularly, but maybe we can discuss this. In 1930, Benjamin summed up a discussion he had with Bertolt Brecht about his relationship to Schmitt. Agreement, hatred, suspicion. These two insights, one affective, the other methodological, can be derived from this short dialectic comment. Benjamin's approach to Schmitt is not only ambivalent, it is radical and extreme in its polarity. Benjamin indeed entered deeply into the realm of Schmitt, came close to his decisionism, but primarily stole some of Schmitt's weapons only to use them against him and what he stands for. A little bit like what you did. The most frequently discussed instance of the actual dialogue between Schmitt and Benjamin occurs between Schmitt's political theology and Benjamin's dissertation on the Baroque mourning play, his essay, The Critique of Violence, and their respective reflections on Hamlet. In all three instances, and I just summed this up, the similarities between the two thinkers are undeniable, but as has often been pointed out, the differences are crucial. Benjamin's, at times, ominous flirtation with the Schmittian decisionism also leads to the most radical measures of deflecting it. This occurs primarily in terms of its temporality, its source of sovereignty, so rather from below than from above, just the agency of it, and the nature of its violence. Benjamin links his own imperative of what he calls now time, Jetztzeit, with messianic delay and disjoins the decision from sovereignty. Moreover, he modifies Schmitt's agonistic suddenness into a furtive moment of metaphysical insight and associates the decisive force with a semi-conscious bodily presence of mind, leibhaftige Geistesgegenwart. In Benjamin's writings, this is the alternative to the willful decision from above. It is also not limited to the individual, and certainly not to the sovereign, whose task it is, rather, to avert the state of exception and whose creatureliness makes him incapable to decide. So far, a little glimpse into the general discussion in the reception of the Benjamin Schmitt debate. Benjamin's writings undeniably abound with images of abruptness. He speaks of the revolution as pulling the emergency brake of history, the interruption of empty homogeneous time in a moment of standstill, of a shock of awakening, and an abrupt departure from the time of normality. That Benjamin was tempted by a Schmittian decisive gesture is nowhere more explicit than in a letter to Scholem, where Benjamin speaks of his desire, quote, to take leave of the purely theoretical sphere through religious and political conduct. Who, in close to Schmitt's decisionism, Benjamin paradoxically explains his hesitations about joining the Communist Party. He writes that the essential consideration is that every instance of action proceeds ruthlessly and in its own self-understanding radically. Therefore, the task is plainly not to decide once and for all, but rather at every moment. But what is essential is to decide. My own conviction would be to proceed radically, never consistently, in the most important matters. Even where Benjamin comes close to Schmitt's decision, he divests it of its finality and decisiveness. He never joined the party, actually, evoking the necessity of what could be seen as the idea of a new beginning appropriate for each new circumstance. Most relevant in the present context, and hitherto barely noticed, if at all, is a specific and daunting key formulation that both Benjamin and Schmitt use and that can succinctly illuminate their difference. And somebody mentioned it in the past days, but I don't remember anymore in what context. It concerns the notion of the moment of danger that defines the state of exception. This expression, which becomes crucial for Benjamin in his On the Concept of History, written shortly before his death in the midst of the experience of Nazi terror, was generally attributed to him as its original author. At least I thought for a long time that this was Benjamin's expression. In all likelihood, however, it is, in fact, a direct response to Schmitt. In an article titled Der Führer schützt das Recht, The Führer Protects the Law, published on the 1st of August 1934 in der Deutschen Juristenzeitung, Schmitt writes, "The Führer protects the law from the worst abuse when, in the moment of danger, he immediately establishes justice by virtue of his leadership as supreme judge." It's not bad to get some quotes of this kind from Schmitt as well. Benjamin quotes and radically inverts this expression in his sixth thesis on the concept of history. There he has this famous image: to articulate the past historically does not mean to recognize it the way it was. It means to seize hold of a memory as it flashes up at a moment of danger. Historical materialism wishes to retain that image of the past, which unexpectedly appears to man singled out by history at a moment of danger. Where Schmitt hails the dictatorial gesture of Hitler as the sovereign Führer who empowers himself by placing himself above the law, and Schmitt helping him do this, Benjamin calls on the subject of history to grasp an image of the past that flashes by in a desperate attempt to save it from the heap of rubble, dem Trümmerhaufen, to which human history has been reduced, not least, one could add, by Schmitt himself and those who then and now succumb to his seductions. Giorgio Agamben's Pauline quasi-Schmittian reading of Kafka's Before the Law, that has been mentioned today, is a paradigmatic enactment of a contemporary confrontation between German Jewish thought and Schmitt's decisionism. It is also a succinct assault on Benjamin's differed and differentiated notion of the decisive moment. Agamben introduces his reading of the parable as an attempt to present Benjamin's conception of the messianic task. He says this is how Benjamin conceives of the messianic task. This interpretation, I believe, reveals a contemporary supersession of Jewish deferral with the fullness of time. And I condense this to the extreme. It is an argument I made before, and for me, a kind of primal scene to possibilities of understanding why Schmitt could be interesting for some today. Kafka's iconic parable describes a scene in which a man seeks access to the law, is denied entry to it, waits at its door until the end of his life, when the doorkeeper tells the man who has just seen a shimmer of light emanating from the door that this entrance to the law was meant for him and that the doorkeeper will now shut it. He will now close it. I'm proud that I managed this in one sentence. The parable consists mainly of a description of the negotiations of the man with the doorkeeper as he strives to gain access to the law. Whereas traditional interpretations see the situation of the man from the country as a failure, because he waits in vain before the door of the law to which he seeks entrance until the doorkeeper pronounces that he will close it, Agamben views the shutting of the door as the momentous event signifying the fulfillment of the law and therewith the announcement of the end of time. Agamben explicitly counters Jacques Derrida's interpretation of the parable as a positive waiting and an ongoing negotiation with the doorkeeper as a representative of the law, possibly a rabbinic authority. Agamben rejects this vision, which he explicitly ascribes to the Jewish tradition, more particularly and explicitly Scholeng's expression of a life lived in deferment. For Agamben, this constitutive refusal to reach or accept closure epitomizes our prevailing condition, Agamben writes, of a petrified or paralyzed messianism. Agamben sees Kafka's man from the country as a Christ figure who, as Paul would have it, fulfills the law in the pleroma, and he sees himself as a philosophical impersonator of Kafka's protagonist, who in a decisive interpretative gesture conjures the closing of the door to the law and the end of negotiation and delay, particularly the negotiation with this rabbinic authority embodied by the doorkeeper. Agamben opposes a Jewish primal scene, at least a modern Jewish primal scene of waiting, to a Schmittian moment of decision. I doubt that Benjamin would have gone along with this reading. Some evidence. The most Jewish dimension of Benjamin's resistance to Schmidt's decisionism can be found in his comment on Kafka. And I quote Benjamin, "We may remind ourselves in Kafka's stories of the form of the Haggadah, the name Jews have given to the rabbinical stories and anecdotes that serve to explicate and confirm the teachings, the halakha. Like the Haggadic, the narrative parts of the Talmud, Kafka's books too are stories. They are a Haggadah that constantly pauses, luxuriating in the most detailed descriptions, in the simultaneous hope and fear that it might encounter the halachic order, the doctrine itself en route, hope and fear." Benjamin calls this ambivalence of encountering the law Verzögerung, deferral or postponement. And he finds in these not just, and I'm not sure he was using this Christian expression on purpose, the true workings of grace, das eigentliche Walten der Gnade, but also arguably a counterforce to Schmidt's decisionism. And my final figure, and briefly, Hannah Arendt. In a seminal essay on Walter Benjamin, Hannah Arendt notices in his demeanor, particularly in his letters, a curious indecision. She writes, "What in these letters seems like indecision is in reality the consequence of the bitter insight that no solution is adequate for reality, that a solution would lead him into a lie of solving problems." Arendt explains that for Benjamin this would affect his lucidity. If he were to give up his hesitations, Arendt surmises, he would, quote, lose the possibility of an awareness of his situation. Deferment is omnipresent in Arendt's political thought, whether in her description of the public sphere, the sequence constituting the successful revolution, or the condition of thinking itself. The most explicit reference in this respect relates her reflections on revolutionary time to the biblical episode of Exodus. Arendt reads the Passover story, she writes herself, in light of revolutionary ideals. She celebrates the moment of the Israelites' liberation from slavery, but also derives from this story a powerful antidote to the potential violence of revolutions. Arendt's reference to the Exodus story reveals a certain attraction to a decisive moment, the transformative instant of regaining freedom. It represents for her, quote, a legendary hiatus, a gap in historical time that will eventually inspire the men of the American Revolution. Such a gap upends, quote, the currently accepted notion of time as a continuous flow. Arendt describes the impact of the revolutionary moment following liberation from bondage as an instant of extreme intensity. And we've talked about intensity before, and I agree that this is the primary motor of decisionism. And so there is some of that in Arendt as well. But she also calls it an abyss of nothingness with a measure of complete arbitrariness. She warns that such a beginning has, as it were, nothing to hold on to. Arendt's fascination with this moment of liberation is offset by her insistence on the necessity to overcome this abysmal moment through a deferral in order to ensure that freedom continue to reign in a new order. In itself, the liberation from oppression, which leaves behind a passionate hatred of the masters, only leads to reactive violence against the ruling classes. In her book on revolution, she therefore insists on the necessity of an extended interval between the moment of liberation and the creation of a new order. In the final chapter of this book, she emphasizes that The end of the, quote, the end of the old is not necessarily the beginning of the new, and that freedom is not the automatic result of liberation any more than the new beginning is the automatic consequence of the end. There must be a hiatus that opens up the space in which thought, politics, and freedom can unfold. It is also, in opposition to sovereign decision, the time of deliberations in common. Arendt's emphasis on the political lesson to be drawn from Exodus certainly echoes a comment by Maimonides explaining the long interim period between the departure of Egypt and the arrival in Canaan. A sudden transition from bondage to freedom, Maimonides explains, is impossible. It is not in the nature of man that after having been brought up in slavish service, that he should all of a sudden wash off from his hands the dirt of slavery, and therefore a hiatus is necessary. And I end. Although the examples discussed here differ in genre, context, and form, they share a sense of the value of deferral, which, beyond the author's various purposes and goals, testifies to their awareness of the violence inherent in the decision. Similarly, their insistence on deferral points to the importance they attach to alternative options and possibilities, to roads not taken. Deferral is, in their vision, far from a Heideggerian Gelassenheit or an inflationary celebration of a crisis discourse as deconstructive principle of indeterminacy. Rather, deferral is an active mode, sometimes even a highly intense one, that is illuminated against the background of Schmidt's decisionism and the political theology to which it belongs. Beyond the lingering on multiple potential options as a foundation of free will opposing determination, references to the Jewish tradition are manifest in these examples, in their texture of deferral as resistance against the decisive moment, and a fortiori with Schmidt's political implementation of Kierkegaard's moment in the sovereign decision. Whether in Scholem's concern for merciful justice, suspicious of sovereign judgment, echoing Maimonides, Benjamin's graceful procrastination of the law modeled on the Talmud, or Arendt's extended hiatus, analogous to the exodus from Egypt that offsets revolutionary violence, the examples of deferral point to an ethics and perhaps even an alternative politics of deferral inspired by the Jewish tradition. At this point, a longer reflection on the meaning of a Jewish deferral would have to be juxtaposed and contrasted with Schmidt's invocation of the katechon, the figure that, in Paul's letter to the Thessalonians, withholds, restrains, holds back, and delays the redemptive apocalypse. Throughout the millennia, the katechon has often carried the traits of the Jews' stubbornness in refusing to acknowledge Jesus. The ambivalence of this figure of delay, the postponement of the coming of the Antichrist, but therefore also the delaying of salvation, features in Schmidt's political theology as a justification for the authoritarian rule of the sovereign, who, in the meantime, in the short time that remains before the second coming, is responsible for ensuring law and order. This idea of deferral differs starkly from its role in the examples discussed here, where procrastination and delay are enacted against violence and ultimately affirm the human world. Nowhere is this violence more explicit than at the end of Kafka's The Trial, when Joseph K. is brutally executed by two anonymous men who, as the novel's penultimate sentence notes, look at the person they have just killed. But the hands of one gentleman held K's throat, while the other pushed the knife deep into his heart and turned it there twice. With breaking eyes, K still saw how the gentlemen, close to his face, leaning against each other cheek to cheek, watched the decision. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vivian Liska and John Milbank. There are 3 rounds of applause here actually in place. One is to our wonderful speakers for giving and delivering these 2 great talks. The second to our audience, who I could see the thirst to knowledge throughout these 2 talks. And the third round of applause goes to the organizers of the conference who, despite my better judgment, I was listening attentively, so I thought we should learn to live with the elements of nature and the heat in the room and to defer a decision. But the organizers of the conference actually thought it would be best to pause here, not to defer, and to decide to discuss this over dinner for the organizer of the conference. I hope this is acceptable. So then, thank you very much, all of you.